That's just about all you got.
In Houston, a young George and his family settle into a rundown house that still doesn't even have power. One evening, their mom takes a single hamburger and splits it 4 ways for her kids. George, absolutely starving, is ready to dig in, but his sister Mary stops him. They have to say a prayer first. Though he's clearly impatient, George holds off. As soon as the prayer ends, he swallows his piece in one big bite and jokes that he's so hungry he could eat the table. Seeing how hungry he still is, Mary generously gives him half of her share, always believing in her brother's potential. That same night, their mom sits George down and gives it to him straight. If he fails school again, it'll be nearly impossible to catch up.
You promise me you won't fight.
She begs him to stay out of fights and focus on his studies. The next day, things aren't any easier. At school, kids stare at him because of the way he looks. In class, George raises his hand to answer a question, but the teacher overlooks him, choosing a well-dressed student instead, someone with clean clothes and shiny shoes. Lunchtime isn't much better. George sits alone, no food in front of him, while everyone else eats. One boy mocks him for not having anything, then cruelly throws a piece of gross food at him like he's a dog, daring him to fetch it. Furious, George throws a punch straight at the kid's face. When the teacher shows up, he bolts. Looking back, George realized that his go-to reaction was always anger, and beating people up was the one thing he felt truly good at. A few years go by, and we see George hanging out with a friend outside a bar when a drunk guy stumbles out. They decide to trail him, thinking they'll rob him, only to find out he's actually an undercover cop running a sting. The officer quickly turns the tables and backup shows up fast, triggering a chase. George manages to get away by crawling under a house. When the cops arrive with a tracking dog, George covers himself in sewage to mask his scent. The trick works. Neither the dog nor the officers spot him. As George heads home, he catches a commercial on a TV in a store window. It's for Job Corps, offering free meals and drinks to dropouts. The program also gives job training and pays its students, which grabs George's attention. Fired up, he rushes home to tell his mom he wants to enroll. She's on board, reminding him he's got more in him than he thinks. But she urges him to follow through this time. No quitting early just because he misses home. Not long after, George shows up at the Job Corps Center in California. At the gate, a guard lays out the ground rules. Inside, he immediately bumps heads with a guy named Desmond over a bed. Desmond brushes it off like it's no big deal.
It's just a bed, man.
Later, George finds a fresh pair of Converse and a note from his mom tucked in his duffel bag. Desmond notices and looks on, clearly jealous. When George struggles in his electrical class, the others laugh at him. He shoots them a hard stare. He's clearly someone who's used to handling things the rough way. The following day, Desmond is blasting music while George is trying to focus on studying. Annoyed, George walks over and pulls the plug on the record player. Desmond, a bit amused, asks if George has a problem with music. George snaps back, saying maybe he does, especially when he's trying to concentrate. Desmond comments on how uptight George seems. He takes a swig from his flask and offers George a drink, which he turns down. Still, as the two keep talking, the tension starts to fade and they begin to hit it off. George's spirits lift when Desmond invites him to grab food at the chow hall, which makes him genuinely happy.
Now you're talking.
Before heading out, George looks for his new Converse, the ones from his mom, but they're gone. At the cafeteria, Desmond tells him not to worry and suggests reporting the theft after they eat. He also casually mentions he's the reason there are extra brownies today. With his talent for numbers, Desmond landed a gig in the kitchen and quietly adjusted the weekly orders. His budgeting led to more brownies and fewer beans, and he seems pretty proud of that. While eating, George spots a guy walking around in his stolen shoes. The thief locks eyes with George, panics, and bolts straight to his dorm, slamming the door shut. George doesn't back down. He kicks in the door and almost tosses the guy out the window. Just as things escalate, Doc hears the noise and steps in to break it up.
Let's walk and talk.
Once outside, George tries to explain that those shoes were a gift from his mom, who worked hard to buy them. Doc isn't having it. He sternly tells George to get in the car. Doc lays out 2 options for George. He can either send him to jail or send him back home. He lists everything George has done wrong, like hitting 3 corpsmen and, oddly enough, a door, then adds that both he and the door were disrespected. Pulling out some cash for a bus ticket, Doc is ready to kick George out of the program, but George begs him not to. He says he can't go back home. Job Corps is all he's got left. fight. Moved by that, Doc decides to give him another shot. He asks if George has ever boxed before. George says he's only been in street fights. Doc clarifies that he's talking about real boxing, the kind with structure and rules. As it turns out, Doc also coaches the boxing team and sees some potential in George. He jokes that George is big and ugly enough to make it work. George happily agrees to join.
Don't make me regret this.
The next day at the gym, Doc introduces George to his sparring partner. Right away, George takes offense to the guy's jokes and gets fired up. But Doc quickly steps in to remind him this isn't a street fight. Once in the ring, Desmond, being the numbers guy, starts collecting bets from the crowd. As the match begins, George goes in swinging, relying on power rather than technique. It doesn't go well. He's knocked down fast, and everyone watching bursts out laughing. Embarrassed and angry, George storms out and punches a heavy bag so hard it crashes to the ground, instantly quieting the room. In the locker room, Doc catches up with him and tries to calm him down. He tells George that just 6 months ago, the guy who beat him had never boxed either. With the right training, George can get there too. Still upset, George brings up how everyone was laughing at him, but Doc brushes that off. He says George has to block out the noise and focus on learning. From that moment on, Doc starts training him seriously, walking him through boxing skills and strategy. George struggles with things like footwork and coordination, but Doc keeps stressing that boxing isn't just about hitting, it's about thinking smart in the ring. One afternoon, George makes a call home and everything's fine until he brings up that he's been learning how to box. His mom immediately voices her disapproval, saying she doesn't want him involved in fighting. George tries to clarify that it's not just fighting, it's boxing, a sport with structure and rules. Still, she won't budge and even brings up God, leaving George puzzled and asking what God has to do with any of this. Before he can say more, the call ends. He runs out of phone credit. Later on, George gets back in the ring with the same guy who knocked him down before, but this time, the outcome is completely different. Just seconds into the match, George delivers a knockout punch that leaves everyone stunned, especially Doc, who's clearly impressed by how far George has come. After the match, George stops by Doc's office and finds out that Doc used to be a pro boxer himself. He even won his first 24 fights.
Well, my first 24 fights.
Curious, George asks what ended his career. Doc says he had no choice but to trade one uniform for another. George then pulls out a boxing magazine with an article on Joe Frazier and confidently announces that he wants to be the world champion someday. Doc smiles at his enthusiasm, but tells him to be realistic. He explains that becoming a pro takes serious training and discipline. When George asks about the next Olympic Games, Doc tells him they're just a year away, but warns that George won't be ready in time. George is shocked and says he'll be an old man by then. Doc agrees that George has a powerful punch, but says flat out that even with the hardest training, getting to the Olympics by next year isn't going to happen. The story jumps ahead to the summer that follows. George is now 19, and even though he's only been training for a year, he's about to go toe-to-toe with a seasoned Soviet boxer. The commentators are skeptical, doubting he stands a chance. Back home, though, his family is glued to the TV, watching with pride. Everyone at the Job Corps is cheering him on, and even his mom, still uneasy about the violence, joins the rest of the kids in front of the screen. George lands a series of solid hits and takes the gold medal with ease. While he celebrates, waving the American flag, his siblings watch in amazement. His mother, though proud, still struggles with the violent nature of the sport. It's a bittersweet moment for her as she watches her son become an Olympic gold medalist. The next day, George walks through his neighborhood with his gold medal proudly displayed around his neck. He runs into an old partner from his past, who calls him out for waving the American flag after his win. The man compares George's celebration to the silent protest of other black athletes and accuses him of betraying the cause. Feeling hurt and misunderstood, George goes to his mom to vent. He tells her he's tired of being called a sellout. She gently comforts him and asks what he wants to eat. But George says he's not hungry and admits he sometimes wishes God would just take him, which clearly shakes her. Still, her support lifts him. George tells her that one day he'll win the championship belt so no one can doubt him again. She warns him that getting back in the ring means more pain. George, unfazed, says he's the one doing the hurting, not the other way around. At the airport, George notices a gorgeous girl reading a sports magazine with him on the cover. Curious, he walks up and starts a conversation. Her name is Paula. As her flight gets called, she hurries to leave. George scrambles to get her number, but she jokes that his footwork is better than his flirting. She hands him a pen and tells him to give her his number instead. A bit thrown off, George laughs and says he should be the one asking for hers. But Paula coolly replies, asking if she looks like someone who waits waits around for a guy to call. He quickly writes down his number, and as she walks away, George quietly admits to himself she definitely doesn't. Back at the gym, Doc introduces George to the people who will now be part of his inner circle: Dick Sadler, his promoter, and Archie Moore, a legendary former light heavyweight champ. Archie shares a poetic take on fight day, saying that when a title match rolls around, only 2 people in the world matter, and George would be one of them. As George begins his journey toward the heavyweight championship, he starts defeating opponents one after another, each win pushing him closer to the top. With Doc guiding him, George begins training for his biggest challenge yet, Joe Frazier. During this time, Paula gives George a call, and the two begin dating. She starts showing up to his fights regularly, cheering him on as his record climbs to 22 wins with no losses. Eventually, they tie the knot, and George proudly says his vows. After his 36th victory, Doc tells him he's finally ready for the title shot. That moment arrives in Jamaica, the long-awaited matchup between George Foreman and Joe Frazier. Most people don't think George has a real shot, especially since Frazier famously beat Muhammad Ali just 2 years earlier. The crowd roars Frazier's name, clearly backing the champ. Early in the first round, Frazier eats a tough left hook, but quickly counters with strong body punches. He lands another one of his trademark hooks, but just before the bell, George lands a massive uppercut that sends Frazier to the canvas. The bell saves him, barely. In the following rounds, George keeps the pressure on, knocking Frazier down again and again until the referee has no choice but to stop the fight. Against all odds, George Foreman is crowned the new heavyweight champion of the world. At the victory party, George is in the spotlight, surrounded by applause and reporters. In the middle of the celebration, a striking woman catches his attention. He also finds Desmond and offers him a job as his financial manager, pointing out his skill with numbers. Desmond is surprised but says yes right away, pouring out his drink when George tells him it's time to quit. Later that night, George heads back to his hotel room and finds the same woman waiting for him on his bed. Though clearly confused, he doesn't send her away, and they end up spending the night together. But afterward, the guilt of betraying Paula starts to sink in, leaving George feeling unsettled and ashamed. The following morning, George catches an interview where Muhammad Ali taunts him, saying he'll knock him back into the ghetto with a single punch. The comment gets under George's skin and leaves him fuming. A few months later, George throws a family get-together at his massive mansion. He beams with pride as he shows off his collection of cars to his mom, joking that each one has its own vibe. He's happy to see his daughter, but there's noticeable distance between him and Paula. Right before they eat, his mom asks everyone to thank God for the meal, but George cuts in, pointing out that he's the one who paid for it. During dinner, his sister Mary reveals she's pregnant, and Desmond mentions that he's invested all of George's money in reliable stocks, a term George seems to like. Meanwhile, Paula steps away to take a call and finds out it's one of George's mistresses on the other end. She confronts him, saying her life was perfectly fine before he showed up. George gets defensive, asking if she hates the lifestyle he's given her, insisting he's provided everything she could want. Paula calmly responds that she doesn't want everything. She just wants him.
I want you.
George, unable to face her, says nothing. Soon after, George heads to the Democratic Republic of Congo to face off against Muhammad Ali. Over there, Ali is treated like a national icon, and the local crowd is fully behind him. At the hotel, George stumbles upon Ali holding court, cracking jokes for a group of celebrities while roasting George. Ali delivers his signature line, floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee, claiming George's punches won't land because he's too quick to be seen. He also says the media will eat their words after the fight. As George approaches, the room goes quiet, expecting him to clap back, but Ali pretends they were talking about someone else. George doesn't take the bait and walks off without a word, while Ali keeps the crowd laughing. Someone in the group even jokes that if George boxes the way he talks, the fight won't last long. Because Muhammad Ali was so beloved in the country, the crowd rallied behind him with chants of the iconic phrase, Ali Bomai, which translates to Ali kill him. Even with the crowd's energy, sports commentators still believe that after Foreman's dominant win over Frazier, Ali didn't stand much of a chance. As the fight kicks off, George quickly takes the upper hand, landing several strong punches. But Ali keeps provoking him, mocking his power, and taunting him with lines like, "Is that all you got?" The more Ali taunts, the angrier George becomes. He keeps driving Ali into the ropes and unleashing heavy blows. Ali, though, shows off his defensive skills, occasionally landing counterpunches. But the constant pressure from George starts taking a toll. His stamina drops and he visibly begins to slow down, while Ali still looks sharp. Between rounds, Dick and Archie push George to keep the pressure on, urging him to finish strong. Doc, however, looks worried, sensing how drained George is getting and how much his movements have slowed. By round 8, George is completely worn out. That's when Ali flips the script. He starts landing clean, powerful shots and finally knocks George down. The ref calls it Ali wins by knockout. It's George's first ever loss, and the crowd explodes, cheering wildly for their champion, Muhammad Ali. After the match, George starts reflecting on everything. He realizes his obsession with brute force led him down the wrong path. Determined to make things right, he calls Paula and promises he'll never leave her again. But she's distant and emotionally done. She asks him to sign the divorce papers. Looking for comfort, George goes to his mother and tells her he's fired Dick and Archie, blaming them for what happened. She doesn't argue, just listens and supports him. Later on, George makes a surprising move to restore his pride. He decides to take on 5 different fighters in a single day. Most people can't make sense of it. Doc begs him to drop the plan before it leads to something worse. During the event, Muhammad Ali joins the commentary team, grabbing the audience's attention as the fight unfolds. The crowd begins chanting his name, filling the arena with energy. Feeling frustrated and desperate to redeem himself, George calls out Ali for a rematch, sparking a heated exchange between them. Despite the tension and distractions, George powers through his massive challenge, defeating all 5 opponents and knocking out 3 of them, proving he still has incredible strength and skill. Afterward, Doc meets George in the dressing room and questions what he was trying to accomplish by fighting 5 men in a single day. He tells George he should go back to facing 1 opponent at a time. Their talk is cut short when George receives an urgent message. He rushes to the hospital where he learns that his pregnant sister Mary has started bleeding and was admitted in an emergency. George demands the best doctors no matter the cost, but a family member explains they already have the best. They just need a miracle and prayers. While the doctors fight to save the baby, the family begins to pray. Overwhelmed, George steps outside and prays too, asking God why he would choose Mary's baby when she's the kindest person he knows. He pleads with God to take his life instead if a life must be taken. The next morning, George wakes to his mother gently calling him. Together, they go to Mary's room and find her holding a healthy baby, a miracle the doctors can't explain. George meets his nephew, little George.
Say hi to your nephew.
And his mother tells him his prayers were answered. In the following scene, George is seen struggling in a tough match against Jimmy Young, which ends with him losing by unanimous decision. Back in the locker room, one of the coaches tears into him, saying he's blown his shot at a rematch with Muhammad Ali. Exhausted and suffering from heat stroke, George suddenly hears a voice. Confused, he starts asking who said dead, while everyone around him insists nobody said a word. Moments later, he collapses and passes out. When he regains consciousness, Doc tells him they actually thought he had died. George, still shaken, announces that Jesus Christ is alive within him, a claim Doc laughs off at first, thinking he's just out of it. A few days later, George gets baptized. Not long after, he's nervously speaking in front of a church crowd, sharing how he found faith.
I want to give my life to God.
He notices a young woman in the audience listening closely, which helps him settle down. Gaining confidence, he tells the congregation he plans to dedicate his life to God and become a preacher, news that completely stuns Doc. Doc doesn't buy it and suspects the whole thing might be an act. He's clearly hurt by George's decision. George tries to explain, saying it's similar to what Doc once went through when he had to give up boxing. But Doc fires back that he didn't have a choice. George responds that he didn't either. His path was chosen for him too. Later, George pays a visit to Muhammad Ali. When he tells Ali he's found Jesus, Ali jokingly congratulates him, saying he didn't know Jesus was missing.
They told me you retired to preach, but I didn't believe it.
George admits there was a time when he was so full of rage he actually wanted to kill Ali. Now, he's looking for peace and forgiveness. Ali, thinking it's some kind of setup for a rematch, offers to help him work his way back. But George insists he's serious. It's not a stunt. The two eventually clear the air, make amends, and even start a friendship. After that, George visits his ex-wife and his kids, taking the next steps to rebuild what he lost. George offers a heartfelt apology for how he acted in the past, hoping to make things right. On his next trip to church, he approaches the same girl he had noticed earlier and starts a conversation. She admits she's having a hard time believing someone like him, a former boxer, could genuinely become a preacher. In response, George grabs a microphone, steps outside, and starts preaching to people passing by, encouraging them to turn to God.
But the Lord changed my life.
Even when some people make fun of him, he stays composed, showing how much better he's gotten at managing his anger. When he says it was the Lord who turned his life around, one heckler shouts back, asking if it was really God or Jimmy Young who had clearly beaten him in the ring. The girl watches from a distance, clearly moved by how genuine he is. Later at lunch, she apologizes for being so quick to judge, explaining that his past made her question whether he had truly changed. Now that she sees his real intentions, she tells him her name, Mary, and there's an instant spark between them. George takes her for a drive to an old, rundown church and tells her it's his dream to buy it and start his own congregation there. Fast forward 7 years, and George's vision has become reality. He now leads sermons in his own church with his wife Mary and their kids by his side. After one service, a woman approaches him with her grandson, asking if George would be willing to train the boy who started hanging with the wrong crowd. The kid jokes that he'd rather train with Allie than with someone who lost to him. George turns the offer down, telling them to focus on the Bible instead. A week later, while spending time at home with his kids, George sees a news report. The same boy has been arrested for a crime. The moment hits him hard, and he's filled with regret for not stepping in when he had the chance. George comes across an old building that perfectly fits the vision he has in mind and tells his financial manager to go ahead and buy it. We find out Desmond is still battling with alcohol issues. After some renovations, the gym opens, and within a few months, it's buzzing with students. George brings in multiple coaches and even sets aside a special area in the gym called the Muhammad Ali Study Hall. But a year after the gym opens, everything takes a turn. During one of the classes, the power suddenly cuts out. When George checks with the utility company, they reveal the bills haven't been paid. On top of that, Desmond is nowhere to be found. Panicked, George rushes to the bank, only to find out that Desmond had invested all his money into risky stocks that have now completely crashed. George insists Desmond had said they were safe investments, but the banker tells him otherwise. They were all high risk, and now his account is empty. The bank warns George that they'll start repossessing his assets, including his mother's home. Furious, George sends word around town, desperate to find Desmond. His mother, seeing how worked up he is, gently encourages him to find a way to forgive.
You need to leave him be.
Eventually, George tracks Desmond down in a bar. As Desmond tries to run, George catches him and nearly beats him to death. But just before going too far, George catches himself and chooses forgiveness instead. In a last-ditch effort to stay afloat financially, George starts doing sauce commercials and begins selling branded merchandise. Even with these side gigs, Mary breaks the news that it's not enough. They're still drowning in debt. As the bank starts reclaiming his properties, George falls into a deep depression. He pulls out his old boxing gear, hoping to find some sense of purpose. He confesses to Mary that he asked a friend to preach in his place because he doesn't feel right talking about faith when he's lost everything.
I need to fight again.
He wants to return to the ring. Mary's concerned, fearing that it might bring back the anger he worked so hard to overcome. George explains that the only two things he really knows how to do are preach and box, and right now, only one of them can help pay the bills. George pays a visit to Doc, asking him to be his trainer again. At first, Doc pushes back, still hurt by the way George walked away from it all years ago. He warns George against making a comeback, reminding him of what happened to Joe Louis when he tried to return and ended up nearly getting killed by Marciano. George argues that Louis tried to come back at the top. This time, they'd start at the bottom. Doc worries people will just see them as a joke, but George believes if they keep winning, nobody will laugh. To seal the deal, George brings up Doc's own words about how championship mornings feel different, how on that day, only two men on Earth really matter. Hearing that, something shifts in Doc. He tells George he'll take him back, but only after he loses some weight. Fired up, George squeezes into his old gym clothes, joking that they must have shrunk. He starts training with his son, who keeps warning him not to push too hard or risk a heart attack. The workouts are brutal, but Mary surprises him by stepping in to help with his diet and encourage him along the way. After months of grinding, George finally hits his goal weight and returns to Doc, ready to go all in. But during sparring, it's clear he's lost some of his edge. His speed's gone and he's getting outpaced. Doc reassures him that they'll switch up the strategy and train him using a new style. One night, Mary jolts awake from a powerful dream. The next morning, she shares it with George.
I think the Lord spoke to me last night.
She says she saw a vision where God told her George would become heavyweight champion again, and that when he's lifted in the ring, it'll be so he can lift up God in front of the world. Before George's first comeback fight, Doc tells him they'll need the old fire, the rage, to win. But George pushes back, saying he won't fight angry anymore. Boxing, he reminds Doc, is still a sport, and it has rules. George steps into the ring to face Steve Zuski and quietly admits to Doc that he's nervous about taking off his robe in front of the crowd. He says he feels embarrassed because the last time people saw him, he looked like Superman. Doc fires back, saying now he looks more like the Michelin Man, but reminds him it's not a beauty contest. As the robe comes off, it's clear to everyone that George is out of shape. When the fight starts, George keeps his cool, maybe a little too much, even refusing to react when he gets hit. But by the second round, he kicks it into gear and starts taking over, giving Zuski no room to fight back.
He has Sowski in huge...
When it's obvious Zuski's done, George urges the ref to stop the match, telling him it's his responsibility to protect the fighter. Word spreads quickly about George's successful return, and suddenly he's seen as a hero, not just to fans of boxing, but to every middle-aged balding guy out there who thought their glory days were behind them. After racking up 24 straight wins, 42-year-old George finally gets his shot at the title against Evander Holyfield in what's dubbed the Battle of the Ages. George puts up a strong fight, but in the end, the judges all rule in Holyfield's favor. When George visits his bank after the match, the employees give him a standing ovation. Though he didn't win the belt, he's floored to learn HBO paid him $12 million for the fight. Even with that huge payday, he tells Mary that his mission isn't finished yet. He wonders aloud if he misunderstood God's purpose for him, but Mary gently reminds him that he heard right. God did his part, and now it's their turn to follow through. 3 years go by, and Michael Moorer beats Holyfield to take the title, putting George back in the spotlight at 45 years old. Most people laugh off his chances, saying there's no way he can beat a 26-year-old champion with 30 knockouts and a southpaw stance. As the fight begins, Moorer controls the early rounds, and George looks like he's barely surviving. Back home and at the gym, his supporters, including his mom, watch anxiously. After the 9th round, his cornerman suggests they call it quits, saying there's no shame in lasting 9 rounds with one of the best. But in the 10th, George digs deep and lands a massive right hand that drops Moorer to the mat. Against all odds, George Foreman becomes the heavyweight champion once again, at 45 years old, celebrating not just a historic win, but a journey of faith, grit, and redemption.
You did.
The film wraps up by showing that George, at 45, reclaimed the heavyweight title 2 decades after he first lost it. He and Muhammad Ali grew close over the years, eventually becoming best friends who talked on the phone nearly every day until Ali passed. In 1998, Charles "Doc" Broaddus received a huge honor when he was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame. These days, George still preaches at his church and stays active in his Houston Youth Center, continuing the mission that means most to him.